Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. If you don't know already, this is the NIDA Clinical Trials Network Translation and Implementation Special Interest Group. So the acronym there is NIDA CTN TNI SIG. I hope this is where you intended to be. We're glad you're here. And thank you for your continued interest in dissemination and implementation research as applied to the clinical trials network, as I think we all believe that there's more implementation work that needs to be done within the context of clinical trials so that there's a better chance of successful translation of things that we find in the CTN that are effective and work, and we want to scale up. So it's good to gather as much information about that as we can as we go, and really excited about this group and its continued viability. So grateful for all of your interest. I think we have a few things to do today. One, and I'll introduce our guest speaker in a moment, but we also would like to check in with two of the work groups. I know that if you're new to this SIG, you might not know that we have two work groups up and running. One has to do with implementation strategies, and the other has to do with implementation outcomes. So those groups have been continuing to meet and work on things, and they're kind of really task-oriented, time-limited groups that are pretty focused. So we'll hear from the co-leads, hopefully, of those groups. And so we'll save a little time for the end of that. And I think without further ado, I wanted to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Danny Almirall, who I think the world of. He's a biostatistician at the University of Michigan. He's part of the NIDA P50 MAP Center and the D3 Center. He is really one of our foremost authorities on adaptive trial designs and smart designs. And I think, I don't know that he would admit this, but over the past couple of years, has really been forced into working with folks like us around implementation science and implementation issues, and really challenged to think beyond intervention evaluation, and really considering implementation and implementation strategies. So I think he's one of the best thinkers on differences between implementation strategies and interventions. He and I don't always agree about which one is which, but there's always room for a healthy debate on either of those topics. So Danny, we're glad you're here, and it looks like you have someone who's going to be watching you very carefully over there.
Yes, thank you, Mark. First, let me make sure my slides pop up on your end, and then I can tell you who's behind me. Okay, give me a second. So let me know if you see my slide deck. Do you guys see it?
Yes, it's perfect. Looks good.
Okay, so this is Jonathan Marks. He's an undergrad here at the University of Michigan, and he's shadowing me today. How lucky am I? So he literally is hanging out over my shoulder. And I said, hey, you want to see what it looks like to give a talk? And he said, yeah. Isn't that great?
Welcome, Jonathan.
I'm really excited to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces, and I want to thank all of you, especially Mark, for inviting me to do this. I also see Kristen Huntley, who I was able to have a phone call with leading up to, hi, Kristen, leading up to this, leading up to this talk, where I was asking her, what do you think? Do you think I should do this? And she was very enthusiastic, and I appreciate that so much. Okay, so I was told I only have 30 minutes, so I'm gonna rock forward and do this. It's 12:08, so I have till 12:38. Are you ready, Mark? You can cut me off, okay? All right. And oh, by the way, I'm more of an informal speaker, and what that means is I don't care if I get through all my slides, and I really do care that y'all understand what I'm talking about and that you ask me questions. So basically, interruptions are allowed if actually encouraged. So that's actually the approach I'd like. And it doesn't matter if my 30 minutes are up and we don't get to this, because I can send the slides to all of you, okay? Okay, so this is about one part of my research portfolio called Multilevel Adaptive Implementation Strategies. And let's just get right to it. Okay, so here's what I hope you learn about. In 3 minutes time, I want to put you in the shoes of an implementation support professional for about 3 minutes. And I want you to realize how tricky life looks from the point of view of an implementation support professional. Then I'm going to talk about MAISYs, or multi-level adaptive implementation strategies, as one possible solution, not the solution, but one potential solution. And then I'll finally get into science, intervention science. So it's only this third bullet where I'm actually going to be talking about intervention science. The first two have nothing to do with intervention science. They are just the things that live out in the real world. And then if I get to that third bullet, I'm going to walk you through some example studies that I've been a part of and the types of questions they've asked to inform the development of a multi-level adaptive implementation strategy. All right, so let's get right to it, okay? So until I tell you otherwise, take off your researcher hats, and you'll see why I say I do this. So because you guys are the implementation science like special interest group at the CTN, you already know all about implementation. You already know that implementation often requires action at multiple levels. You know, and what I call a level here, a level is a nested collection of recipients, meaning recipients are folks or organizations that I'm going to be targeting with my intervention, okay? The AKA my implementation strategy. So, and that's because the barriers to implementation abound at all these levels. Sometimes the clinicians themselves need some support. Sometimes the clinic directors need support, and sometimes the entire system needs some support to get an intervention into practice, okay? So this is the slide all of you guys already know. And I'm gonna speed through this, but there's barriers at all of these levels. Like at the system level, there's sometimes ineffective communication or monitoring practices or ineffective policies. At the clinic level, there's often lack of support or workflow processes. So like, for example, oftentimes when we're trying to improve opioid prescribing in a primary care clinic, it turns out the clinic doesn't even have a workflow for what to do when that patient walks through the door. There's no understanding of the workflow. Well, that's a barrier to getting evidence-based practices in there. And then, of course, at the clinician level, you might have lack of skills, or they might have very difficult caseloads. And so the barriers abound. And then, of course, we have implementation strategies, which are nothing more than interventions, but they're interventions with the intent of improving some sort of implementation outcome, like adoption of an evidence-based practice. And so you have things like audit and feedback, which are system level. You have facilitation, which might be clinic-wide, and you might even have one-on-one coaching with a clinician, okay? Okay, so these are the slides none of you needed me to share, all right? All of you are experts. So now remember, I asked you to get yourself into the shoes of the implementation support professional. And what I want you to realize or appreciate is how difficult things look from the person or organization that is doing all these implementation strategies. The reason things look so tricky is when that implementation support professional or organization arrives at the system or the clinic, they have so many implementation strategies to choose from, but each of these Post-it notes are different recipients at different levels. So it might be different clinicians inside the clinic, might be different clinics inside the system. And the real challenge to the implementation support professionals is, what strategy do I reach for this particular level and this particular clinic in this level, or this particular clinician in this clinic? And that's really, really, really difficult. And it all comes down to heterogeneity. And I'm not just talking about heterogeneity, no clinic is the same. I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that what works for one target, that is, what works for one clinic, may not work for the other. That's between clinic heterogeneity. But this is true also at the clinician level. What works for one clinician doesn't work for the other. And then even more nefarious, perhaps, is what works in the short run is not what's needed in the long term, and vice versa. And so interventions, probably the support we're providing these systems probably has to change over time. And we call that within target heterogeneity. And the kicker is that this is happening across all levels, both the between target heterogeneity and the within target heterogeneity is happening at all the levels. All right. What I've done in the last 3 minutes is I put you in the shoes of an implementation support professional and hopefully convince you how difficult it is. So what the implementation support professional needs is they need a guide to solve these heterogeneity problems, okay? And that's where MAISYs come in as one potential solution. It's not the solution, but it's one that we're playing around. So let me tell you what a MAISY is. And rather than give you a mouthful, why don't I just give you an example? And I did not, I have a loosely related to substance use example in example 1, but example 3 might be a little more squarely in line with what many on the CTN study. So let me show you an example of a MAISY, okay? Now here's the deal. This is not in clinics. This is in schools in my great state of Michigan. And let me tell you what's happening. In the great state of Michigan, every high school has between 1 and 4 school professionals, and these are like psychologists, social workers, and so on, whose sole goal is to provide mental health and substance use services to all their high school students at that school, okay? So depending on the size of the school, you'll have anywhere between 1 and 4 of these individuals. Everybody with me? So these are the folks responsible for all preventive interventions, universal or individual, for substance use disorders. These are the folks responsible for transitioning the kids out of the school and connecting them with services. And the great thing is Michigan has them. That's great. Thank goodness. The problem is a survey was done and 90-something% of these school professionals do not use evidence-based practices. And that was shocking to me. And I hope it's shocking to you. Okay? And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to sort of do this first pass attempt to get CBT, which is an evidence-based practice that can be used for mental health, you know, it's sort of domain agnostic, into the hands of these school professionals. So that's the goal here. The goal here is, how do I get CBT into the hands of these school professionals at all the schools in the great state of Michigan? Everybody with me? So that we can help the kids with substance use disorders or at risk for them with their, you know, help them with preventing them from evolving and things getting worse, or even connecting them with some support outside the school. Okay, that's the goal. And we did this using a MAISY, a multi-level adaptive. And now let me describe the MAISY to you. Okay, so here's the MAISY. In step 1, in week 0, and this is about 2 months before the school year begins, okay? We did this district-wide intervention where we actually did this. We went to the Holiday Inn at the county, at all the counties in the state of Michigan, and we invited all of the school professionals from all the high schools to do a training on CBT, and it was over 2 days, okay? And it included 5 components. We trained them on CBT principles. We gave all of them website access to a website where we have all of the CBT manuals and, you know, all of the CBT products. You know, if you ever wanted to know how you would go about intervening with a child of this kind, well, it's all on the website. We have a newsletter, which is mainly for engagement purposes. By the way, when I'm saying we right now, I am an implementation support professional. I am not a professor at the University of Michigan. I'm not a scientist. Okay, so this is what the implementation support professionals were doing at this county. We also launched a monitoring protocol. which is nothing more than, let's keep track of how you're doing, you know? Are you providing CBT? We're going to be checking in with you, and we onboarded them to that monitoring protocol. This is not a research protocol. And then, of course, we gave them a phone number and said, patted them on the back and said, okay, here's your certificate. You've graduated. Now go on and do CBT. Call me if you get stuck. Okay, that's the technical assistance phone number. Okay, and it really is, Mark, call me if you get stuck. It isn't, I'm going to call you. It's the sort of the $2 sign intervention. Call me if you get stuck is a very inexpensive intervention because you got to call me. And we all know no one ever calls. Okay, Mark? Okay, that's the reality. Despite how much engagement and newsletters and how many times I show them the phone number, no one ever calls. Okay, all right. At week 12, and now we are in the school year. Mark, we're inside the school year. We actually can identify schools. And when I say we, I mean the implementation support professional. We can identify schools with school professionals that did not get any other training other than what they got at the Holiday Inn, or they have not yet provided any CBT to any of their students. And we already know that in the great state of Michigan, that is unacceptable because we already know the demand for CBT is through the roof. So if you are a startup school, if this happens at your school, okay? And if you are, then that school got coaching. Now that is extremely expensive. But before I tell you about what that is, if you were not a startup school, you did not get coaching. So you stay the course on rep, the newsletters, I'm available for a phone call, and so on, okay? So what is coaching? Now coaching has $4 signs, Mark, because this is actual in-person coaching. The implementation support team drove out to the high school, and we sat there for weeks and watching them do the CBT and giving them feedback. Okay, are you with me? This is coaching for skills. Okay, and then at week 21, we checked in again. And it turns out that at week 21, some schools were slow responding and some schools were responding. So the slow responding schools are the schools that, despite it being week 21, either the SP reports not providing CBT to 3 or more, to 10 or more students, which is, again, a very low bar, or the SPs report a lot of barriers to trying to do CBT at their school. And you would be amazed at the kinds of barriers we learned about. For example, I'm not getting along with my principal. My principal doesn't believe in social work or psychology. They don't even want to give me a room in which to do group CBT. Believe it or not, this is happening in our great state of Michigan, okay? It may not be happening in California, Mark, because you guys are always 10 years ahead of us, but in the great state of Michigan, this is happening, okay? So what did we do for slow responding schools? Well, we offered facilitation. And facilitation is what I call a business level intervention because it isn't about skills coaching and CBT. It was more about trying to break down the barriers. For example, how do you talk to your principal so that you can be an effective school professional to get CBT to these kids? And so that's what we call facilitation. Is everybody with me? And the intervention, that is this multi-level adaptive implementation strategy, ended at week 44. Everybody got it? Which is roughly the end of the school year, okay? So Mark, this is an example of one multi-level adaptive implementation strategy. It's multi-level because we were intervening at the district level and at the school level. And in fact, we were also intervening at the school professional level. All right, everybody with me? Yeah? Any questions so far about what a MAISY is? All right. If you don't understand what a MAISY is, I want to stop and hear your question right now because the rest of this talk is pointless, okay? And I did have another example here, but I'm not going to go into as detail like I just did. You know, this example was one that I did with my colleague, Andy Quambeck at the University of Wisconsin. And what we were trying to do here is we were trying to get non-cancer primary care clinics to adopt opioid prescribing guidelines, the CDC published opioid prescribing guidelines. And so you can imagine that here We had an intervention at the system level, which was audit and feedback and educational meetings. That happened system-wide. And then at the clinic level, we had to decide, do I provide practice facilitation or not? And then at month 9, do I do peer provider coaching? That is, do I actually sit down with the prescribers in these clinics and coach them on how to meet the CDC guidelines? Okay? All right. So why MAISYs? Why would the CTN be interested, or why would the investigators that are part of the CTN be interested in MAISYs? Or what would the significance section look like of your grant? That's really what this is about. Well, the speed of adoption often varies across these clinics and these systems and these clinicians, and not all targets are ready to take on more. So you might have to just, strategize about when to provide an implementation strategy. You might want to do strategic sequencing of these strategies over time. Because maybe laying down a strong foundation now is critical to you being able to respond to a future implementation strategy should you need it, right? Does everybody see that? So this is what I call strategic sequencing, right? Or there's the health equity angle, right? In some ways, MAISYs are consistent with what many of you call vertical health equity principles. Why? Because a MAISY, in a world of limited resources, for example, I can't drive out to all the schools in the state of Michigan to do coaching. I need to think carefully about which schools do I provide coaching, right? So you need a MAISY. You need something to help you inform how you think about which are the schools that need coaching, right? But there are other reasons too. A lot of us like to sweep engagement under the rug, and that's a big problem, right? So like, no implementation strategy is useful if no one shows up to your webinars, or you could do practice facilitation all day, but if none of the clinicians in the clinic showed up or engaged in practice facilitation, well, it's useless, right? So you might actually be adapting the provision of strategies to respond to disengagement or to prevent disengagement. That's another reason why you would want a MAISY. And all of us in this room know that more is not better. So if there's one thing I've learned in my 20 years as an intervention scientist, is that kitchen sink strategies absolutely do not work. And so MAISYs are good for that because you sort of only provide more when needed, or maybe you step down when you're doing well, right? Okay, I'm going to pause here because it's 12:27 and I only have about another 15 minutes left in my talk, but I want to pause here because I am now going to ask you to put your researcher hats back on, but the rest of the talk is pointless if you didn't understand what a MAISY is, or if you will have some clarification questions. So let me pause here and ask you for clarification questions on what a MAISY is and why it's important. Does anyone have any questions about it? Mark, we're good, you think?
I think we're good. My question looks like it's going to be addressed with this next bullet point, which is where was the randomization
right
in your previous design? So I was curious about that. It looks like Antonio. Hey, Antonio.
Yeah,
hey,
but
Mark.
let me answer your question first before Antonio goes on. Hey, Antonio.
Hey, Nan.
Mark, I love your question, but in the first 2 bullets here, there was no randomization because there was no research. I'm about to show you the randomization. I'm about to show you what we researchers can do, but there's no point to me doing that until we understand what the randomizations are going to be for. It's for constructing really good MAISYs. Antonio, what's your question?
In fact, I was going to ask the flip side of the coin that Mark is beginning to raise, and I got a feeling you're going to deal with this later, Danny, but I'll ask it now anyway,
yeah.
Right? Not only have you not talked about randomization?
No.
You're almost talking about the opposite, right? Because
the
idea of delivering additional intervention is contingent on where the outcome is at a particular point.
You got it.
Almost, right. So
you got it. You got
so
it.
I think that's kind of where Mark was going.
Yeah.
Right. It's certainly what I've kind of had in the back of my mind. And I know you got an answer for that, but
I got one. I got one. Let's do it because you guys just set me up. All right.
I was about to say, I probably put it on a T for you, right?
Yeah, you set me up. You put it on the T. So watch, let me give you all a pop quiz real quick. What type of randomized trial design would you use if you wanted to evaluate the thing I showed you, the MAISY, that MAISY I showed you that I just presented? And I'm just going to answer for you, so because I only have a 30-minute talk. You would use a 2-arm confirmatory clustered randomized trial, right? Right, Antonio? Like you would randomize, your 100 schools in the great state of Michigan. 100 of them get this MAISY, and the other 100 get some usual care. That's what you would do if you were an evaluation scientist. And the only reason I have this slide up here, is this is not what I'm going to talk about for my last remaining 12 minutes. What I'm going to talk to you about is what I'm showing you here, using randomization to construct an optimized MAISY. And if Mark had given me more than 30 minutes, I can give another talk on the distinction between constructing a MAISY and evaluating one. But it's actually a pretty simple concept, Antonio. If you all believe that MAISY is ready for prime time, just do a randomized trial to evaluate it. You're good to go. Your 100 schools get that one and 100 schools get usual care. That is not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the use of randomization to build a really good MAISY. Are you ready? That's what I'm going to talk about next. And that's called optimization. Okay? So let's talk about it. Let's do it. So here are what I call the basic 4. All right? Everybody loves these questions because they're so easy to understand. So one of the questions a lot of CTN scientists might have is, what's the effectiveness of earlier stage strategies? Like in that MAISY I showed you earlier, what's the effect of coaching, right? And question type 2 is, what's the effect of later stage strategy? So in the MAISY I showed you, what's the effect of facilitation? Because that one came later, right, Antonio? All right. Others of you on this call might say, well, I really want to understand how the coaching in stage 1 and the facilitation in stage 2 worked against each other or with each other. Like, did 1 + 1 = 3, or did 1 + 1 = -5, right? Did it backfire? That's sort of just the interaction effect, Antonio. And then, of course, some of you are saying, Danny, don't even bother with adaptation. That's too complicated. Why don't we just give all the schools rep? No adaptation. Or why don't we give all the schools coaching? No adaptation. So these are what I call the basic 4. All right? And so let me show you a study. Now, this is the first time today I'm showing you a trial. First time today, Antonio. And this is a SMART design. Remember, SMARTs are not for evaluation. No. SMARTs are for optimization. And what we did here is we randomized all the schools at week 12 to whether or not they get coaching, because I wanted the answer to that type 1 question. What's the effectiveness of coaching? And then at week 21, if the school was not responding, if I had a slow responding school, I randomized them to facilitation versus not, because I wanted to know, among the slow responding schools, do we really need facilitation? And if the school was responding, then they just stayed the course. Okay, everybody with me? So this is an example of an optimization trial. You would do this trial because you're not quite sure what the effectiveness of coaching is or what the effectiveness of facilitation is, but you would also do this trial because you're not really sure which schools ought to get coaching. Remember how in my example I had the startup schools got coaching? Well, actually, that was just a hypothetical. We don't actually know that the startup schools should get coaching, right? Whereas we did know that slow responding schools should not, whereas we did know that responding schools should not get facilitation, but we don't know that slow responding schools should get facilitation. So we did that randomization. So this is an example of a trial that is going to yield data so that you can develop a really good MAISY so that the next researcher later can evaluate it. Everybody with me? And the real question for you guys in the CTN is, does the CTN want to participate in optimization randomized trials? And I think the answer is yes, because we're already seeing, well, we've seen this for 20 years. Our interventions rarely pan out. And some of us in the literature are making an argument that we just need better optimizations. We need to optimize them first before we evaluate them. this is an example of a trial that seeks to optimize a MAISY before we go evaluate it. Everybody with me? So let me show you some more questions. Actually, before I do that, let me just show you, because I'm running out of time, but let me show you the results of this trial because they're fascinating, Antonio. I mean, like if you're about to get goosebumps. Are you ready? Before I show you the results, I want you guys to realize, okay? I want you guys to realize that embedded in the study, some schools never get coaching or facilitation. Everybody stare at this for a second. So if I'm a school that got randomized to no coaching, then all I see is rep, right, Antonio? And if I'm a school, well, all the schools that are responding continue on rep. But if I'm a school that was a slow responding school that didn't get facilitation, I only saw rep. You see that, Antonio? So embedded in this study, inside of here, there's kind of like something called usual care, if you care to think about rep only as usual care. You guys see that? So some schools in the study never get an adaptive anything. They just get rep. Okay, there's another one that's also not adaptive. Watch this. Some schools in the study, well, they all get rep, but some schools get coaching, and then regardless of whether they're a slow responder or not, they continue rep, which means there's no adaptation. So there's some schools that only ever get rep, and there's some schools that only ever get rep followed by coaching, but no adaptation. But then there's two other kinds of schools. There's schools that there's adaptive interventions in here. There's two embedded adaptive interventions, right? I start with coaching and I'm not doing well and I get facilitation. And if I'm doing well, I don't. Or I start with no coaching, and if I don't do well, I get facilitation. If I'm doing better, I don't. So inside of this study, Antonio, there's two non-adaptive interventions and there's two adaptive ones. Now, if you were an old school or older school, evaluation only scientist, and you thought, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a 2-arm trial of rep only, because that's my control, right? That's the lowest intensity, $1 sign, versus the most expensive MAISY here, which is do coaching and do facilitation. All right, that would have been your 2-arm. Now watch that. Keep that in the back of your mind. You ready? Because I'm going to show you some results. On the y-axis here is our primary outcome, which is the amount of CBT delivered by the school professionals inside of the schools. So immediately you know why I call this a clustered SMART, because the primary outcome, Antonio, is the amount of CBT delivered by the school professionals in each school. And I was randomizing schools, right? So this is a clustered SMART. And on the x-axis is time, okay? All right, so here we go. Look at the results. So if there's a circle, that is the non-adaptive intervention. So the blue ones, the blue circle is rep only, $2 signs, the least intensive intervention. And if you see a triangle, that means it was adaptive. So for example, the most expensive MAISY is this green triangle, which is I did rep, I did coaching. If you were doing well, I didn't do facilitation, but if you weren't doing well, I did facilitation. Now take a look, Antonio, take a look. Did we see an effect between the most expensive, the green triangle, and the least expensive? We didn't. Oh my goodness. This is yet another, this is like the 5th study I work on where the kitchen sink did not pan out. Okay? In fact, the best of all the interventions was the blue triangle, which is the adaptive, which is the MAISY that did not provide coaching, but did provide facilitation to struggling schools. So this is just sort of meant to be provocative. It's meant to have you think, and here's a real world study with real world results. And by the way, these are our pre-specified analyses, and they were published exactly as we pre-specified them. And you can go read the paper. Fascinating paper. And I think my time is up because it's officially 12:38, and I promised Mark I wasn't going to go over. But here's what I want to say as I depart for our discussion. Okay, what I want to say is we barely scratched the surface because all I did was show you 4 types of questions that you might want to ask if you were constructing a MAISY. It turns out that in your own time, when you read through this talk, there's a total of 13 questions I lay out here for you. There's questions about tailoring. Because a lot of people ask me, well, Danny, how did you know how to define what a slow responding school is? Yeah, that's like the first question I always get. Well, there's all sorts of questions and analyses you can do, but the key is, if you have any one of these questions as you read through here, that means you are now an optimization scientist, because you are asking questions about how to make the MAISY better. And if you're asking questions about how to make the MAISY better, the SMART is one, not the, one of the tools you might reach for as a CTN scientist. And let me stop there. I want to thank you for your time. I'm really cognizant of the time because Mark said, Danny, don't go over. So I'm going to stop there, and I want to thank you guys. But if you are interested in constructing MAISYs to improve the adoption of evidence-based practices and SUD services, I want you to reach out to me or Mark. I want you to reach out, because this is the only thing I want to be doing right now is MAISYs to improve the adoption and implementation of substance use, evidence-based substance use treatments. Thank you very much. That's it. That's my talk.
Thank you, Danny. That was awesome. Let's open it up for questions.
Yeah, jump in. Jump in. Antonio, you said you had a follow-up. Your hand is still up.
Well, that's me clapping as opposed
all
to
right.
coming with the question. I'll come with the question in a little bit. I'll let other folks chime in first.
Okay. Yeah, I would love some questions, especially if the CTN thinks that they might be interested in these kinds of trials to answer these kinds of questions, you know. That's fascinating to me. And I really want to support the CTN if they are interested. I want to support them to be able to do this. You know what I mean? I want to do that. Any thoughts?
Hey, Danny, this is Brian Shannon,
Hey,
OHSU
Brian.
in Portland, Oregon. Hey, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
This is one of the second times I've heard the talk, and I learned so much more listening to it.
Awesome.
And I think one of my questions, I had kind of two questions. One is like, okay, so how do you go about picking the implementation strategies, like the rep, like how, you know, if it, or the coaching, you know, when that seems like there's a process thinking about that. And then I think the second one, more general, like, you know, I'm early career, you know, K award. I don't, is it, what is the right, is this for something that's for a fully vetted EB, you know, evidence-based practice like CBT, you know, it's pretty, the evidence base is really strong. You know, I think it seems like there's certain questions this is method is good for, others may not be good for. I don't know.
Well, there's a lot of, I'll try to go quick, but there's a lot of questions embedded in your question. And I'll start with, I want to say, first of all, what you see in front of you right now is a full-scale randomized trial. Okay, this was a full-scale R01 and that budget, you know what I mean? So what I'm showing you now, SMARTs are not pilot studies. That's the first answer to your question. But now to your other question. So, okay, so why am I saying that? Well, to be able to do a trial like this, you have to be ready to pull off a full-scale randomized trial, right? You got to know how to recruit clinics. You got to know how to recruit schools. You know, you got to be top-notch, right? Just like you would any full-scale trial, right? Okay, that's the first thing. So now let's come back to your question from the early career point of view. All early career scholars are working their way to be able to do a study like this, right? So that means two things. It really only means two things. Number one, do you have the skills to pull off a full-scale randomized trial? And that's what a pilot is for. The purpose of a pilot is to prepare you as an early career person to be able to do a full-scale randomized trial. The second purpose of a pilot is to refine all of the implementation strategies or interventions, because you can't refine them in the full-scale trial, okay? So like rep, we already knew how to do it. We already knew about its feasibility. Coaching, we already had the manual for it. We already knew how to do it. Facilitation, we already knew it. These decision points, we already know how to do it. In other words, when you get to, and by the way, what I'm saying right now is not unique to what you see in front of you. What I'm saying right now is unique to any randomized trial. Before you do any randomized trial, you have to have all of your interventions manualized, or implementation strategies manualized and sealed up, and they have to be feasible and implementable, right? Otherwise, you can't do a full-scale trial. So Brian, to your point, if you're in early career getting excited about this, then ask yourself, what are the tools I need to learn to be able to pull off this design? That's you as a researcher. And then, do I have an adaptive intervention or a MAISY, and is it feasible? And if it's not, then you need a pilot. Let me stop there. Yeah.
Danny, I want to jump in and say thank you so much. This is really, really fascinating. I had kind of a different question. How do you plan power for a study like this, where you don't really know from the get-go how many people are going to be kind of filtered into these subgroups? What do you do to prepare for that?
Right. So well, let me just say that do not worry, and I'm looking for my slide. Do not worry. That is what I do for a living, right? As a statistician, I develop the tools for you to be able to get the power. So I now have multiple papers on how do you do the sample size calculation. So I'm not going to bother going through it, but we have it. And one of the things you're going to learn is that these formula do rely on your best guess at the response rate after stage 1. See that little R there that I'm pointing at? So for example, if you were to do a study like this, you do need a sense for what my response rate, like in other words, of all the schools that entered the study, how many of them are going to be responders? But it turns out, Crystal, I think that was Crystal asking the question. It turns out, Crystal, even if you don't actually know that R, which I don't recommend, I think you need to have a good guess at it. But even if you don't know how many schools are going to be slow responders, we could actually still do a sample size calculation that is the most conservative, meaning that it's like the worst case scenario. We just say, oh, if we say R is 0, notice what happens to the sample size. You could still get a sample size. So this is what Antonio does. This is what all biostatisticians do. Whenever you are unsure about a value that goes into a sample calculation, you go the conservative route. But the point, so we have all that, Crystal, and you have nothing to worry about, and I can send you to those papers. But the point is, you do have to have from the clinical side some sense that a good chunk of your schools are going to be slow responders. Otherwise, how would you even justify re-randomizing slow responders? Like, let's imagine a world where only 5 of 100 schools are slow responders. Well, I can't justify randomizing 5 schools. You know, so a little bit, as with everything, statistics only gets you so far. Then you got to bring your implementation and your clinical science to the table. You know what I mean? But what I want to do is make you feel like comforted. We have the sample size calculators, and we have, you know, does that help? I hope it helps.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I'll stalk your work a bit to learn more.
Come stalk at the D3C website. We put everything we do on our website for free. As a national resource, you know, we're a P50 funded NIDA center. So we are a NIDA P50. And as a national resource, my opinion is I am the world's, right? You guys own me, right? Like everything I do goes on my website. So it's all there for your taking, okay?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Danny.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks for your question, Crystal. How about one more, hopefully, maybe quick question, perhaps quick answer. Kelly, I saw your hand next.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation, Danny. I'm Kelly Ashburner from Dartmouth. And I just want to, I have a, maybe just some clarity around the way this is the conceptualization of the MAISYs and how they fit with the SMART. So the MAISY, it seems like you could think about a MAISY, so the multi-level adaptive implementation strategy, in the same way you think about a bundled implementation strategy or discrete implement. It's like you would say, I am interested in these multiple levels of implementation and these strategies within that. And then if I'm interested in studying optimization, you're studying the MAISY within the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. So the MAISY is like a way of conceptualizing a multi-level adaptive implementation strategy. And then that fits within the SMART if you're interested in studying the optimization of that.
Right. Yeah, you got it. And I only want to add one more thing. So let me recap what you just said, because it's exactly right. The MAISY is the thing the implementation support professional does.
Yep.
But you, Kelly, are not an implementation support professional. You're a researcher. The researcher reaches for an experiment to construct a really good MAISY, correct? All right. So you, as a researcher, you might reach for a SMART. Notice how I said might, because just because you're doing research on MAISYs does not mean you have to use a SMART. And if you saw the longer version of this talk, you would see that I would go on to give you other example optimization trials that are not SMARTs. So just to clarify once more, the MAISY is the thing that lives out in the real world if every one of us lost our jobs. Like if the researchers all disappeared, there's still going to be an implementation support professional out there implementing evidence-based practices, right? That's the MAISY. It's for them. For you and I, we're researchers. We do science, so we do randomized trials. Are you with me? And so the SMART is one tool you might reach for, not the only tool, if you were interested in optimizing a MAISY. But, I only had 30 minutes, so I didn't give you like all your options.
Yeah, that's great.
Helps.
Thanks.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Danny, again, we're really grateful. I also wanted to echo really everyone's interest probably in following up with you. And I know you make yourself readily available. You're also part of the RP50 Center, the Center for Dissemination Implementation at Stanford, and on the faculty of our research core. And I know you've been very generous to all of our other faculty and fellows with your time and expertise as well. But I do look forward to more MAISYs, more MAISY trials within the context of the Clinical Trials Network and beyond. And really appreciate your good work. And apologies to some of you who had your hands up for questions, and hopefully you'll know how to reach Danny. All of these presentations are archived and available for viewing. Alain has put the link in the chat, and we've had a bunch of really good ones, and this is definitely among the best. So really grateful to have everyone's time. I think we wanted to check in with the work group leads. I don't know if Joe or Sophia want to just update the group on implementation outcomes. Maybe keep your eyes on the clock. We want to respect everyone's time and be sure to stop at the top of the hour. So maybe just a couple minutes, Joe, Sophia, if you can do that.
Of course. So as a reminder, the implementation outcomes work group is working on a systematic review of CTN studies that have been incorporated, of CTN studies that have incorporated implementation outcomes. And it's based off of the outcomes frameworks by Proctor and Glasgow. And our time frame of the study is from the first CTN study through CTN 121. And at this time, we've completed data extraction and have some preliminary results minus 2 studies that are pending consensus. And we're currently discussing with our group to go over results and additional steps to summarize and present the results in a paper. And with that, I'll pass that on to Joe.
Great, thanks, Sophie. Thank you for your leadership on the review. I wanted to, do you see a slide here? I wanted to share a resource with you all.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. So I wanted to just, this is kind of a new resource that I really wanted to strongly recommend hot off the press on the topic of implementation outcomes. It was made by and for night addiction treatment researchers. So it's part of the Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science, as well as the Research Adoption Support Center, which are centers led out of Stanford. Dr. Beth McGinty at Cornell and Will Becker at Yale, they led a work group of implementation scientists to develop this guide on how to, it's a how-to manual for scientists who are conducting effectiveness studies to guide them through thoughtfully incorporating implementation outcomes into their trial. So if you click on that link there, I'll show again that link. If you click on that, it'll take you to a website where you can just download this manual. What's really cool about it is it goes through, it's set up through the Proctor implementation outcomes framework. So the 8 domains of implementation outcomes, it has a section on each implementation outcome. And for each outcome, it walks the investigator through reasons why they may wish to measure the implementation outcome, some rationale. It provides guidance on who to collect the measures from and when. It even gives some example measures, and it provides key considerations as well as examples from published studies. And so on here on the left, and it's really nice and short and sweet. So on the left, you'll see an example of acceptability and how it's described. When is it pertinent? And on the right, you see some from the adoption outcome domain. It shows some key considerations and links to example studies. So to get this, just go to this website here and scroll down. There's a bunch of guides on different implementation on different implementation topics. This one is integrating implementation outcomes into effectiveness studies. So I wanted to share that because we're all, clinical trials network researchers conducting effectiveness studies, and that's who this guide is really for, is scientists who are designing effectiveness trials but want to add on an implementation component. So I thought that was pertinent. So that's all we got. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Joe. It's really tempting to want to know what the early results are looking like from your review, but I guess it's too early to ask, and maybe you want to build suspense in terms of how implementation outcomes have been incorporated into the CTN project so far. So I'm not going to put you on the spot, but many of us are anxiously awaiting the findings that you're going to come up with. So that's awesome. Awesome work. Implementation strategies, the interventions of implementation. I think Camille doesn't look like Camille's here, but Brian.
Yeah, Mark, Camille wasn't able to be here, but I can speak to this as the other co-chair for the group. So I think people that have been tracking this with a SIG for a couple of years know that we've been working on a scoping review focused on implementation strategies for reducing SUD stigma. As that work continues, I think we are passing through the abstract screening phase and now getting into full text review. I think we started with something like 4,600 or thereabout articles in the literature, and have that down to something just short of 200 that will be reviewed. So trying to be inclusive with our criteria, make sure that we're not missing anything important about this pervasive topic. And so I think we'll try to update the SIG when we have things that we can say with more definition about that, but want to commend, again, a volunteer group. See many of our individual members here today, and Yuri and Hannah and Reed. You're looking a little like something's happened since the last time I saw you, but I hope all is well there. And so thanks to Noel and Owen and Therese and others that I know have contributed along the way too. But the work continues, and we'll continue to work toward what I hope will be an impactful review paper on this pervasive topic of stigma and how we reduce it.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Thanks to members of the work group. It's great, Brian, that you acknowledged everyone too. So I know everyone, this is an add-on to people's already more than full-time jobs. So we really, I know it's a labor of love and service. So we're grateful for all of the good citizenship that makes this stuff work. I think I wanted to just remind folks that our next meeting is in May, Tuesday, May 21st, which seems like a long way off. Hopefully it'll be spring across the country by then, everywhere. And really excited about the person presenting, Dr. Arthur Robin Williams, who's at Columbia University. You might associate his name with the addiction care cascade. I know talking about the MAISY designs earlier, we actually use a lot of Dr. Williams's criteria for access, engagement, and retention in our measurement-based implementation approaches, so much as number of students who receive CBT being considered responders or non-responder schools. We use the Robbins criteria for successful access, engagement, and retention to determine if a clinic goes on to receive more intensive implementation support. So it's really, I think it's really important work that he's been doing. It's all really based on the evidence, based on big data analyses, but also translated in really comprehensible and simple ways, so that we do have really good ideas about criteria for high quality addiction treatment, specifically around medications for opioid use disorder. So I think that's all we have for today, for this morning. I guess it's the afternoon already in parts of the country. So we're grateful to everyone for being here, and look forward to seeing you in May, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you again, Danny.
My pleasure. Thank you all for letting me be here. Cheers.